Welcome to Underrated History. I'm Jason. I have a really different one here today. Told you yesterday I hadn't really thought about who I was gonna do today, but this one was actually pretty easy to reach as far as unheralded history is concerned. And so here we go. The man I'm going to be talking about today was the final leader of East Germany. And first of all, you're probably going to ask yourself, well, what was East Germany? And then beyond that, I don't know any leaders of East Germany. Well, East Germany was born out of a compact that was reached by the Allies at the end of World War II. And that Germany would be split into 4 different zones of control. And these were 4 different zones of control were controlled by the British on one, the French on another, the Americans on the third, and the Soviets on the fourth. Now, as you can probably guess, 3 of these are constitutional republics with free elections, and the 4th is not, or was not. And East Germany was the zone under which was the Soviet zone, and the other 3 zones combined would become West Germany. And for a short while, they were controlled by what was called the Allied Control Council. But in 1949, 4 years after the end of the war, the Soviet Union turned their control zone into its own country, which was East Germany, or the German Democratic Republic, GDR. One thing you'll learn about socialist countries is that they will usually have democratic or Democrat in their name, but it would be anything but democratic. It's basically kind of a farce that they in their titling utilize to try to roost people, but of course nobody's fooled. North Korea's official name is actually the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or the DPRK. Communist China, of course, is called the People's Republic of China. So back to Germany. In 1949, the Soviets took their zone and turned it into the Democratic Republic of Germany, or the GDR, German Democratic Republic. And the Western Allies turned their zones into West Germany, or the Federal Republic of Germany. So it's like, okay, well, West Germany, of course, freely elected its leaders throughout its entire history. And, of course, the GDR did not. In addition to this zone separation by the Allies, they also took the city of Berlin, which was, of course, the capital of Germany, and split it into 4 zones of its own, under similar auspices. The French, British, and American zones became West Berlin, and the Soviet-controlled zone became East Berlin. And these 4 zones happened to be, Berlin was 100 miles inside of East Germany, which created many historical events on its own. Having a West Berlin was not officially part of a single country. However, its residents were considered West German citizens. And they did use the West German Deutschmark for its currency. And of course, if you know a little bit about history, you know that the border between the two was the Berlin Wall. A wall that hundreds of East Germans would be executed trying to cross to freedom. This wall was built in 1961 by then East German leader Walter Albright. Albright is the first leader of East Germany. He was succeeded and purged out by Erich Honecker, who purged Albright and allowed him to leave under the pretense of physical illness. So Honecker was the second and basically the longest running leader of East Germany. He overthrew Albright in 1971 and continued as basically the supreme ruler of East Germany until 1989. Now, this is was supposed to be a Russian puppet state, but the strain started to come into the picture in 1989. As you may know from your history books, or may not know, Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms that were called Glasnost and Perestroika, which sought to liberalize the Russian economy and to liberalize the Soviet government. Now, Honecker was thoroughly opposed to this. He famously told Gorbachev that we do not need any reforms. We've had our perestroika, we've had our glasnost. We do not need to do anything. The two men would go on to despise each other because Honecker thought that Gorbachev was turning his back on socialism, and Gorbachev thought that Honecker was being inflexible. He lumped Honecker in with inflexible hardliners, which included, in addition to Honecker himself, the likes of Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania, and then finally, as I mentioned with North Korea before, Kim Il-sung of, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. However, within the East German inner circle, Honecker was then causing strife of his own within his own nation's leadership and within his own inner circle. This is where the number 2 man of the East German government comes into the picture by the name of Egon Krenz. Krenz arranged a meeting of the Politburo, which is the executive organ of government in basically any communist regime. The DPRK has a Politburo, the Soviet Union had a Politburo, and therefore so did East Germany, the German Democratic Republic. So Krenz worked behind the scenes to set up a meeting to overthrow Honecker, because things weren't looking very good for them, economically and otherwise. We had the strain at the Berlin Wall. We had a Gorbachev that was pressing for reforms within East Germany. So Krenz, like any good politician, secured the votes and counted the votes and arranged a meeting of the Politburo with Honecker and the rest of that organization at the time in the middle of 1989. Now, He telephoned Gorbachev before he attempted this. Gorbachev repeatedly wished him good luck. And he knew that he was going to need it. But Krenz got it. He had the votes, he had everything all counted up and tallied up before the meeting. And Honecker, at the end of as was customary at the end of the meetings at the time, asked if there was any items that anybody wished to put on the agenda. Krenz stood up and said, basically respectfully, I wish to place the motion on the agenda for the removal of Comrade Erich Honecker as General Secretary and the election of Egon Krenz as the General Secretary. And to which Honecker said, okay, well then, let the debate begin. Hours and hours and hours of men in these powerful positions then piled on and testified against Honecker. Not a single man spoke in his behalf. Some debate, huh? In the end, they took the vote. As was tradition within most communist governments, Honecker voted for his own removal. And much like with Albright 28 years prior, Honecker was allowed to step down under the pretense of medical reasons. So Egon Krenz became the third and wound up being final leader of Communist East Germany. There were other heads of state after him in the months following and leading to the reunification of Germany in 1990. But Krenz was the last communist leader of the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. Now, what does that have to do with anything? Well, as I mentioned, the Berlin Wall was the border between the two states within the city of Berlin. And we get to October 1989, and policies were being drawn up that would allow freer travel between East Berlin and West Berlin. Word of this, of course, got out because most of this was being publicized in West German media, which the majority of East Germany could actually receive. Signals would reach FR. The Berlin Wall could not stop TV signals. And so, unfortunately for them, for this fact, the now Krenz-led government was confronted, and his spokesman, a man by the name of Guter Sabdowski, which could be another edition of this entirely, much shorter one though, was confronted in a TV press conference with, we have word here that this legislation or order to allow open travel between the two sides of Berlin was going to come into effect. Sabdowski was asked, when? When is this going to happen? And his words became etched in the fate of German history after this. Sabdowski's words were this: as far as I can tell, immediately, without delay. Krenz didn't prep his own spokesman for the inevitable question. This immediately launched a flood of East Germans piling up to the Berlin Wall. The writing was already on the wall, figuratively, if not literally, that it was going down. And because of this state of affairs, the same East German guards, border guards, who were taught to shoot to kill, or shoot to kill immediately any individual trying to get through this border fence wall. He even had an empty strip of several hundred meters on the East German side of it to allow these guards to shoot at anybody trying to escape. However, by this particular point, the German guards knew what they were up against, and they were not going to. They were just too afraid to shoot anybody, and reasonably so, because the implication by this point was that if anybody was shot by a border guard, they in turn would be attacked. And by this time, they were up against thousands and thousands and thousands of East Germans who their own government spokesperson said was going to be opened immediately and without delay. And so that was literally the fall of the Berlin Wall. All because the final communist leader of East Germany didn't prep his own spokesman on the talking points. And so this is the significance in the fall of the Berlin Wall of one Egon Krenz, who overthrew the government, but then was overthrown himself after this happened. As he said in a press conference later on, Honecker had 28 years. He himself only had 100 days, which is how long his government lasted. Now, the state of East Germany would continue on after Krenz's overthrow. However, it would continue on through a council led by different political parties other than the German Communist Party, which had full control of the country for the previous let me do my math here, from 1949 to 1989. 40 years. For the last 40 years, it was one-party rule. The successive councils had 3 parties in them, two of which would go on to be part of the unified German government under Chancellor Helmut Kohl after 1990. So, this is the story of Egon Krenz, who, by the way, in 2025 is still alive. He's approaching 90 years old these days, and to this day he still firmly defends the GDR, or Communist East Germany. He defends it to this day, even though he lives within a free Republic of Germany. So this is the story of Egon Krenz and how one man's blunder caused the Berlin Wall to fall. As the final communist leader of East Germany, there were 2 successive heads of state in that short period of time between the fall months of 1989 and reunification in 1990. Manfred Gerlach is one of them, and he was the leader of one of the opposition parties that came to be in the wake of the fall. The last person I could probably do an entire episode about, her name was Sabine Bergmann-Pohl. And she still lives on today as well. And she also served in the Kohl government of a reunified Germany, basically to reunify as a representative of the former East government, to allow for a somewhat smoother reunification. Same went for Gerlach. But the last communist leader in Germany was Egon Krenz. Very interesting story about how he used the same playbook that his predecessor used to overthrow the initial leader of East Germany. He used the same playbook himself to overthrow his predecessor, take control, if only for a few months, in 1989, and then his own blunder caused the fall of the Berlin Wall. Actually, didn't cause it; it just sped it up. It was coming anyway. I'm thinking of the great German rock group, the Scorpions, and the song they wrote about these events in 1989, "Wind of Change." A powerful anthem about how everything came to be and how the winds of change did indeed sweep across what was then the Eastern Bloc. So anyhow, this is today's episode. Egon Krenz. You guys have a good Labor Day weekend. We will see you next time. Peace out, homies.